Hello, welcome to the bookshelf. This is a podcast series brought to you by the Institute of South Asian Studies, ISAS, at National University of Singapore. I'm Ivan Lidarev. I'm a visiting research fellow at ISAS, and I'm very glad to be your host for this episode. Today, we'll be speaking with Dr. Paul McGarr, who is the author of a wonderful book about intelligence in South Asia, Spike in South Asia, Britain, the United States, and India's Secret Cold War. So, Dr. McGarr, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Evan. It's delighted to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Dr. McGarr is lecturer in intelligence studies at King's College London. Before this, he taught at University of Nottingham. He has a very kind of brilliant biography, of which I'll give you just a couple of highlights. He's a fellow at the Royal Historical Society. He's also a fellow at the Royal Asiatic Society. Dr. McGarr has published extensively on intelligence history and U.S. Foreign policy. He has published 3 books: Spying in South Asia, which we're going to discuss today, The Cold War in South Asia, Britain, the United States, and the Indian subcontinent, which in many ways I would argue is kind of almost like a parallel reading to Spying in South Asia. So I strongly suggest that you get both of them, not only one. And of course, he has also published India at 70, of which he's the editor. And Dr. McGarr has a number of fellowships, the most prominent of which are with the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., and the JFK Presidential Library in Boston. So, Dr. McGarr, thank you so much once again for agreeing to this interview. You have published a fascinating book filled with a lot of interesting material, so it's not easy to start unpacking it. But probably the first thing that kind of grabbed my attention in your book is the argument that India was the Berlin of the East during the Cold War. So why was India the Berlin of the East, in your opinion?
It's a really good question. Firstly, thank you for inviting me on the podcast, Evan. It's very kind of you. It's lovely to speak to you today. It's a really interesting term, I think, and it struck me when I first came across it. And I came across it by looking at contemporary Indian newspapers from the 1950s and particularly the 1960s. They kept referring to this phrase, the Berlin of the East, and I'm sort of intrigued that they were doing so. And I think the genesis of that came from the fact that India acted as a sort of a melting pot or a meeting place between East and West in Asia. And I think there are a number of reasons why that took place. So the fact that India was one of the first nations in Asia to decolonize, so August 1947, India and Pakistan have partitioned, they become independent nation states. And India is one of the first at the forefront, really, of that process of decolonization in Asia and Southeast Asia. And obviously, Jawaharlal Nehru, India's first prime minister, is a very prominent figure in the movement for decolonization and how it pans out, not only in Asia, but also in Africa. And Nehru's decision to follow a policy of non-alignment is really crucial to that. I think that he doesn't want India to be dragged into a conflict between East and West. He wants to escape the shackles of colonialism. He doesn't want to be dependent as independent India on any other external power. So this notion of pursuing an independent foreign policy is possible. Obviously, it's not possible to pursue a completely independent foreign policy, but trying to get that sort of equidistance really between the Eastern Bloc and the Western Bloc, particularly as the Cold War develops. That sort of independence really creates a sort of liminal space in New Delhi, particularly where diplomats, politicians, journalists, economists, NGOs all converge on New Delhi, both from the East and the West. And also intelligence officers follow that because it acts as a great sort of honeypot, really, for recruiting agents from the other side of the ideological Cold War sort of fence, really. So we get this convergence of people from both sides of the Iron Curtain in Delhi during that period. And George Blake, a famous sort of SIS, MI6 officer from Britain, comments in his memoirs that alongside Berlin, New Delhi is the best place in the sort of early Cold War period to recruit agents because they're just so freely accessible. Interaction and sort of meeting people from the other side of the ideological Cold War is just really easy in Delhi. Those meetings happen all the time. During that period. It's also helped, I think, by the fact that India is a democracy. It has a free press and it has freedom of movement. So people can move around the country and move around the capital relatively freely as well. So that facilitates that sort of interaction, really, in many ways. So, yeah, it's an interesting sort of context. And I think to some extent that's problematic for the Indian government. So the Indian government do not like this label Berlin of the East, because they're trying to create a notion that they have independence, and this notion that they might be this espionage of center within the East is really problematic for them in their relations, not only with the Soviet Union, the Eastern Bloc, but also with the West as well. And we may get onto this later, but it's complicated by New Delhi becoming a center of Cold War defection as well. So once the Berlin Wall goes up in 1961, and it becomes much more difficult for people mainly from the east to go to the west, but also the other way sometimes. It becomes much more difficult to defect in Europe once the Berlin Wall's gone up, and sort of that sort of barrier descends across Europe. But India still represents quite an easy place to defect, and it becomes a center for defection. So there's a really prominent defection in 1967 where Stalin's daughter, Svetlana Aliyeva, defects in New Delhi in 1967. And that really creates a problem for the Indian government because they don't want New Delhi to be seen as a center for defection. It complicates their relationship, for example, with Moscow when that happens. Moscow's obviously very disappointed that defection has happened. It's a massive propaganda coup for the West that it takes place. And it puts the Indian government in a really awkward and uncomfortable position, really. So the fact that it becomes this sort of center for defection as well just reinforces that notion that the parallels with Berlin and what's gone on in Berlin in the past, really. So quite interesting. And the other point I'd make very quickly is it's reflected in popular culture, which is really interesting. So I don't know if many of your listeners are fans of spy fiction. I am. I love spy fiction. It's a really interesting way of approaching the sort of secret world, really. And John le Carré, the famous British author, in one of his seminal books, Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, sets a key defection episode where George Smiley, the sort of lead British secret intelligence officer in that novel, tries to lure the key Soviet agent Carla over to the West, and he does so in a New Delhi jail, in Tihar jail in New Delhi. So that scene is set within India. And it's interesting because that book's published in 1974, before historians have really been able to access records on what happens in India's Cold War. And it's Le Carré sort of nodding to the fact that, yeah, India is a really important center for the Cold War. It is this Berlin of the East. It is a center of defection. And we get a fictional representation of that, which I think is mimicking what's going on in real life, really. And Le Carré obviously famously was an MI5 and an MI6 officer before he became a novelist. So it's interesting that people from the secret world are also in spy fiction, giving us sort of hints about what was happening during the Cold War.
Yeah, once things get from history into fiction, they stay there forever. Like Kim, for example, and the idea of the great game. I mean, once it moves from one side to the other, there is no going back. So it enters into kind of the popular consciousness, and kind of the Indians, in this case, probably could never ever do anything about it. It will be seen like this for a lot of time. Well, you focus a lot in your book on the British origins, the British legacy in the development of the Indian intelligence service. And of course, you have the same thing in Pakistan, obviously. But I would argue that there is a very substantial difference between the evolution of Indian and Pakistani intelligence. So what do you think accounts for these divergent paths of India and Pakistan? Because India at the beginning focuses much more on domestic intelligence, very much under British colonial influence. But my sense is that Pakistan chooses a very different path. So what explains this divergence?
That's another excellent question, actually. Really good question that gets to the
Thank
heart
you.
of what I'm saying in the book. So fantastic. Thank you. I think a lot of it goes back to the trauma of partition. So we have to remember that India is a sort of a unitary nation state before 1947 under British rule. Obviously, India's always been the idea of an Indian state is obviously contentious because there have been different princely states, and India, as a whole, has had quite an interesting political and social history before 1947. But the British have governed it as a unitary state up until that point. And of course, we have partition along religious lines, along communal lines, where the Muslim majority provinces in India in 1947, based on the eastern wing of the country and the western wing of the country, split away from India proper and go on to form East Pakistan and West Pakistan. And of course, East Pakistan subsequently in 1971 becoming Bangladesh. So we get this partition along religious grounds and along communal grounds within the subcontinent. And in a way, that mirrors what happens in intelligence terms. So the fact that separation, that bifurcation of India that occurs in 1947 is obviously political and geographic, but also it's in terms of the intelligence service as well, and the armed forces, I'd add as well. So India has as an army, a unitary army in 1947. That has to be split between the new nation states of India and Pakistan. Roughly, India gets 2/3 of the military assets at the time of partition, and Pakistan gets roughly 1/3 of those assets. And that happens in intelligence terms as well, that the division of intelligence forces happens. Intelligence, actually, interestingly, is a much more complicated element of partition. So politically, the British have been preparing India and Pakistan for independence really since the 1930s. They're not reluctant to give independence, but they're beginning to cede increasingly political power, certainly at a local level, to Indian and Pakistani sort of officials during that period in the run up to 1947. Similarly, in the military sort of side of things, there's a relatively clean cut in terms of a division. It's more complicated in terms of intelligence because of the way India has been governed in security and intelligence terms by the British colonial state. So they've tended to give intelligence power not to the Hindu majority in India, but to the Muslim minority. So it's a divide and rule strategy, really. And then just culturally, the British concept is, we can trust Muslims more than we can trust Hindus. Hindus are the majority. They're pushing for independence. So most of the officers in the Indian Intelligence Bureau, or most of the people working with the Indian Intelligence Bureau in the lead up to independence tend to be Muslims. So they move over to Pakistan. So we have a sort of movement of officers over to Pakistan. Most of the high level officers in Indian intelligence are British. They either go back to the UK or they go into other colonial outposts in India or Southeast Asia. So there's sort of a lack of expertise around that period, and also lack of material resources as well. It's quite a difficult separation. But what comes out of that separation generally is that India becomes the most powerful state in South Asia, economically, politically, in terms of military power. It's significantly larger in terms of all those aspects than Pakistan. That, I think, enables Pakistan intelligence to develop in a very different line to Indian intelligence. So Indian intelligence becomes very much internal, about trying to make sure that the Indian state doesn't split apart. So intelligence becomes focused on Kashmir, for example, and retaining Kashmir. It becomes focused on a communist rebellion in southern India, in Telangana. It becomes focused on movements for sort of to break away from India in northeast India as well. So it's very much about trying to ensure that India, at a really difficult time, remains a unitary nation state, which is by no means certain in 1947. We tend to sort of look back and think, well, India is always going to be a nation state, but there were lots of movements trying to pull India apart in 1947. So it's a very insular internal focus. I think Pakistan has a very different approach to intelligence. And because of that internal focus in India, it becomes very much a police intelligence system, really, a domestic police intelligence system, which is under civilian control, which is interesting. Pakistan, I think, because it looks at India, its neighbor. I remember India and Pakistan go to war in 1947 over the disputed state of Kashmir. So immediately they're formed into two nation states. Immediately they're in conflict, in armed conflict over Kashmir and who will control Kashmir. And because of that, because Pakistan's looking across at a neighbor it regards as innately hostile and irredentist in many ways, many Pakistanis think, well, India's just going to try and reincorporate us back into the Indian state once the British have left. It adopts a much more of a securitized military culture, I think, throughout Pakistani society. It's like a country under threat almost immediately for its very, very sort of existence. It faces this, what it regards as an existential Indian threat. And because of that, it pursues a much more militarized approach to civil society, I think. And that's reflected in its intelligence services, which almost immediately come under control of the armed forces in Pakistan, who dominate Pakistani politics and Pakistani society, really from 1947 onwards. So Pakistani intelligence develops within the military. It becomes, most famous through the Inter-Service Intelligence Agency, ISI, and almost immediately comes under military control. And I think that's because of the securitization of the Pakistani state, because it sees this huge threat coming from India. And so they do very, very quickly, almost immediately from 1947, develop along very different lines. And that's because I think they see threats in different contexts. India sees an internal threat to its survival, and Pakistan sees an external threat to its survival. So one goes the civilian route and one goes the military route.
Thank you. That was a very comprehensive answer to a very kind of complex subject. So, as a China specialist, I was struck a little bit by the difficulty of Indian intelligence to decipher Chinese behavior. They were completely, I think, shocked by 1962. They didn't have good intelligence on what was coming, and obviously this prompted a number of reforms. So, what do you think does this kind of lack of understanding of China tell us about Indian intelligence, especially in the early Cold War? And I want here to put an asterisk. Some people have argued that this kind of difficulty with understanding China persists to this day, in the sense that if you look at the history on the border in the last, let's say, 20 years, 15 or 20 years, it's difficult not to see a number of cases in which India has been once again surprised. So why? in brief, does this happen so often?
Yeah, again, it's a really good question, I think you're absolutely right. It does have historical sort of roots, but also contemporary sort of resonance, really, in many senses. And I was really surprised. So there's a lot of obviously history about, and William Dalrymple's just published a really good book, The Golden Road, which surely
Mhm.
talks about this, the extent to which this connection between India as an expansive power in sort of ancient times and spreading out on trade routes and becoming a really influential sort of binding or connective force across South Asia, Southeast Asia, and even into China. Um, so there's these links, commercial, cultural, between India and China, which have been very well established over a considerable period of time. But I think interestingly, and I think probably this again, without criticizing British imperialism too much, although it's obviously very worthy of quite a lot of criticism. I think it's has its colonial roots as well, in that under the British Empire, the sort of competition or the great game that takes place in South Asia and along the sort of northern Himalayan border between the Russian Empire, Britain, and also the Chinese Empire to some extent, it creates this sense of division or colonial states partitioning what they control and keeping that quite remote or isolated from interaction, either culturally, linguistically, in terms of commerce. So the British wanting to safeguard and guard what they've got in India, they almost shut India off from that trading commercial relationship, cultural relationship with China to some extent. And I think that's reflected after 1947 when independence comes. I was always really shocked by the lack of. So India goes through a period where it reaches out to China and tries to court China after 1949, and that's complicated by the fact that actually Jawaharlal Nehru, India's first prime minister, has quite a close relationship with nationalist China. So before China, the Chinese Revolution, October 1949, Nehru is very close to nationalist Chinese leaders. He's had quite a lot of interaction with them. He's traveled through China prior to October 1949. So he's sort of torn between what he regards as sort of personal affinity to some leading figures in the nationalist China, and also the reality in geopolitical terms that communist China is going nowhere. It's going to consolidate power. It's going to be a really important player regionally, and India has to get on with communist China as well. So initially, that relationship is a bit frosty and difficult. But Nehru does reach out to China, so, as you know, in the 1950s with Hindi Chini Bye Bye and visits Beijing, and so there's this notion of trying to get those relationships on a better footing. They negotiate a treaty over Tibet and try to increase bilateral trade, but that sort of crumbles quite quickly over the border dispute. I was always struck that when that tension arises over the border dispute between India and China, that India is really poorly placed, as you quite correctly stated, I think, to understand the way China's thinking or to trying to rationalize things from the Chinese perspective. And I think that's because it's been so cut off and isolated. So I was really shocked when I found that India did not have an intelligence officer stationed in the People's Republic of China undercover at all until 1957. And that was one officer in the Indian embassy in Beijing that was posted in 1957. They tried to post another intelligence officer into the Shanghai consulate just a few years after that, but they actually couldn't find a candidate that was suitable in the entire Indian intelligence system because very, very few people spoke Chinese. Very, very few people had any cultural understanding about China as a nation. India just wasn't engaging or hadn't engaged intellectually or linguistically with China at all, really. So Nehru at that point is scrabbling around saying, well, we want to put another intelligence officer in Shanghai, but the IB, the Intelligence Bureau, could come up with no candidate, not a single candidate who was suitable to occupy that post. So I think it was really interesting that linguistically, culturally, India seemed to sort of not academic studies on China were really poor. There were very, very few people in India who spoke Chinese in the 1950s and 1960s. So you always got this sort of lack of academic and intellectual interaction with China. And I think that creates this sense of not really understanding China, not really understanding the way China works. Very few Indians living in China and reporting back. And interesting, it's the opposite of China. So there's big Chinese diaspora in places like Calcutta and Eastern India that are actually supplying the Chinese government really useful intelligence on what's going on in India. So from the other side of the coin, China is getting some quite good intelligence from its diasporic communities, particularly in Eastern India, about what's going on in India. So I think China's much more plugged into Indian politics and Indian society than India is. So yeah, I think it's historic, but it's also surprising. And when India does try to correct that, it takes an awfully long time for them to do so, and then relations sour so much that it's difficult for India to place intelligence officers into China. And I think I was speaking to some Indian colleagues recently, and although matters have obviously improved dramatically and Chinese studies in India are a lot better than they were, there is still, I think, a huge sort of dissonance between China's sort of approach to India and the amount of focus it puts on trying to understand India and India's interaction with China as well. So obviously the border issues over a considerable period of time have complicated that interaction. But yeah, it's surprising how many people in India don't study China, don't learn the language, don't really focus on Chinese domestic politics, given that it's so critical to India's national security. And yeah, I've always been perplexed by that. I think things are getting better, so I think it's a positive story. But it's starting from a really low base, I guess, which is interesting. And I think in some ways that explains the shock of 1962, and that Indians really aren't reading China, aren't really aware of the political developments in China, don't really have very good intelligence on China. I think most of the Indian intelligence on China in 1962, certainly domestically, is being fed to India by the United States and the United Kingdom, and British and American intelligence on China is not very good either. So, so, so yeah, it's an interesting, it's a conundrum that India faces, I think, in 1962.
Yes, I would argue, I do agree that until recently there was not a lot of attention in the wider kind of strategic enclave, let's call it that way,
Mm,
the strategic kind of community within Delhi on China. I mean, they tended to focus much more on Pakistan than on China. And I think that in the last 15 years or so, this has gradually started to change. So I think that now
yeah.
there is a kind of a new crop of young and kind of very bright specialists, many of them
Yeah.
educated in very good international institutions, and in some cases in China itself. So I think this is starting to change, but it will take some time. It will take some time, and obviously it requires kind of a very consistent investment of the Indian state into this, and this obviously takes a lot of time.
Yeah, I completely agree. And it's interesting because I guess it sort of waxes and wanes or ebbs and flows. When tension is high, then those relationships tend to sort of be constricted. And once, during periods of very good bilateral relations, those relationships tend to flourish. And it hasn't been a linear story, I guess, has it? It's been sort of quite episodic in terms of how it's developed. So, yeah, I completely agree. I think there's, as you said, there's room for optimism, I think.
Yes, yes, very much so, very much so. So, going back to your book, I mean, I was thinking how one can read your book, and there are many ways in which you can read it, but one way is to read it as kind of the story of the transformation of Indian intelligence into kind of a fully functioning external intelligence service, of course, with a lot of British and American support. So, what drove this transformation, in your opinion? Was it personality of the supreme leader? Because obviously Indira Gandhi was very different, had very different approach from Nehru on intelligence. Was it kind of the shock of external events, such as the revelation in '67 of kind of American operations, spy operations in India? Was it '62 war, or was it even kind of American and British support in some ways? Because obviously this kind of gradually led Indian intelligence in a certain path of kind of becoming more active, more professional, more externally kind of oriented. So, what do you think drove this transformation of Indian intelligence?
So yeah, it's a complex question. I think you're absolutely right. There is an evolution over time, and it's quite a sort of fundamental evolution, really. So Indian intelligence, I guess, as we've intimated, starts off from a really low base. So the British leave India really bereft of any functioning intelligence service, which is at a time when India is going through the trauma of partition and also facing threats from Pakistan and slightly later from China, which is a real strategic problem for the Indian state that it doesn't really have a functioning intelligence service in 1947 at a time when it really needs a functioning intelligence service, both of domestic security, but also because of external threats that are crowding in India during that period. So there is a sort of issue there in terms of they're starting from a very, very low base. They're also, I think, sort of hampered in their evolution to some extent by the cynicism, or I shouldn't say cynicism, I guess skepticism is a better way of putting it, of Indian leadership, particularly Jawaharlal Nehru, to intelligence generally as a sort of an element of statecraft. So, and that's understandable when you think about Nehru's personal perspective. I mean, Nehru's been in the 1930s and the 1920s even a leading figure in Indian nationalism. So he's been at the forefront of the campaign for Indian independence and throwing off the shackles of British colonialism. And because of that, he's been targeted by the British colonial security
He
state.
was on the
So
receiving
he's
side of intelligence.
yeah, so he's been a sort of victim of intelligence, for want of a better word. So his family have been put in jail. Nehru spent a lot of time in jail. His daughter Indira Gandhi has seen her father locked up in prison. Their mail has been intercepted. They've been subject to oppressive surveillance. But their lives have been turned upside down by intelligence. And Nero, as a victim of intelligence, that's inevitably coloured his psychological approach to intelligence once he becomes a consumer of intelligence and a leader, ultimately of an intelligence agency when he's in his prime minister. So he's really reluctant to sanction an expansion of Indian intelligence beyond which he thinks is absolutely necessary. So for Nehru, it's a civil liberties issue. It's an issue about democracies. It's an issue about not having a secret state that the colonial Britons effectively run in India to suppress Indian nationalism. So he's very cautious about funding and expanding Indian intelligence, both domestically but also abroad as well. So Indian intelligence offices do push, for example, for stations to be set up across the globe. And Nehru says, no, we don't need that. Our diplomats in our embassies are more than capable of providing all the information we need. And we don't need intelligence officers to operate. So India does open a couple of centres, one in Paris, one in Germany, one in London, but they're very, very limited. So their intelligence outreach externally is really, really small. And one of the reasons why 1962 happens, I think they're very internally focused. So it takes quite a long time for Nehru to overcome that sort of skepticism. Intelligence officers are always saying about Nehru, he's a really harsh customer. So when they produce an intelligence report, Nehru will say, well, this is heavily critical of them often. Says, look, I know I've read the reports that were produced on me by intelligence agencies. I know how inaccurate they were. I know how problematic they were in terms of the information they were reporting on me, which was often false. So I'm going to be a really hard taskmaster in terms of the intelligence you give me, which was both good and bad for Indian intelligence, I think. So Nehru acts as a sort of a political check on the expansion of Indian intelligence, really while he's in government, I think. And it's only the shock of the 1962 war that really encourages him to, for example, seek closer intelligence liaison with the United States to try and expand Indian intelligence during that period. But Nehru dies quite quickly, dies in May 1964. And I think the big transition comes, I think you're absolutely right, with the coming to power of his daughter Indira Gandhi in 1966. And Gandhi takes a very different approach to intelligence. She's often quoted as saying, like, well, my father was a saint, I'm not. And a much more pragmatic approach to governance and international relationship on the part of Indira Gandhi. And I think that spilled over into intelligence. And I think, again, there's two dimensions to that. I think one is international and one is domestic. Domestically, Indira Gandhi comes to power in October 1966. In 1966, as one of the first few female leaders anywhere in the world. Really, Sri Lanka's had a female president and prime minister. India's at the forefront of this sort of gender revolution, where women are becoming leaders of nation states. But Gandhi experiences, and Srinath Raghavan's written a lot about this in his wonderful new book on Indira Gandhi, a lot of prejudice, a lot of political opposition, a lot of people within her ruling Congress party think she's just going to be a figurehead that they can manipulate. She's referred to as a dumb doll or a sort of, a woman that they can just control and manipulate. So she faces really strong opposition with her own party and within India generally, really, to the idea of a woman governing India. I think because of that, she wants to use every lever of power she can adopt within the Indian political system to support her sort of position. One of those is intelligence. So I think she looks at intelligence and says, look, one of the ways I can use intelligence is to bring that within my control, the control of the Prime Minister. So the Intelligence Bureau in India has traditionally been under the control of the Home Minister, who then reports into the Prime Minister. Nehru forms a research and analysis wing, India's new external intelligence agency, which becomes a sort of the dominant sort of figure in dominant organization in Indian intelligence. She forms that in September 1968, and she explicitly says, this will report directly into the Indian Prime Minister, i.e. me. I will control Indian intelligence. And that gives her tremendous bureaucratic power within the Indian state. So it's really important for her. I think also she's looking externally, and particularly at the United States, with whom Gandhi has a very complex relationship. So I wouldn't say she's anti-American in any sense. She has a lot of American friends. She admires the American sort of projects as a sort of democratic project greatly, but she also has problems with American projection of American power overseas and what she regards as neo-imperialism on the part of the American state. So she looks at what America's done in Iran in 1953 and Guatemala in 1954 and the Congo and elsewhere, and says that this is really problematic in terms of America using its secret states intelligence services to try and manipulate democracies and nation states across the developing world, across the global south. So she looks at the United States and CIA and has a genuine fear that the CIA, because she's a socialist prime minister to the left of the political spectrum, that the United States may try to subvert her government in some way and remove her from power. And research analysis from Indian intelligence gives her a sort of a support network to push back against the Central Intelligence Agency. So I think you're absolutely right. A lot of it comes from the domestic politics of India and the dynastic sort of approach of the Nehru family to governance. I think a lot of it also comes from failure. So as an intelligence historian, a lot of the work I do is about intelligence failure, or failure in inverted commas, or why intelligence fails. And I think that the 1962, as you mentioned, but also the 1965 war with Pakistan, where India again is caught by surprise to some extent by Pakistan, really fuels the need within the Indian bureaucracy for intelligence reform. One of the things that comes out of there's a Brooks Henderson report in 1963. Every intelligence failure has a big report, obviously in an inquiry, and that inquiry basically says they need intelligence and functioning correctly. It's far too insular, hasn't read Chinese, hasn't looked across, that doesn't do horizon scanning very well, doesn't look over the Himalayas, doesn't know what's going on. We need to reform Indian intelligence. Also points to the fact that Indian intelligence is really a police service, as we mentioned, it's very insular. So one of the reasons why the research analysis spring when it gets formed, I think in 1968, is because of those intelligence failures, this recognition that Indian intelligence is a bit outmoded, it's a bit anachronistic, it's a bit insular, and India now is becoming a sort of regional power. It needs a much more effective foreign intelligence service. So yeah, a combination of factors, I think.
Fabulous. That was very kind of comprehensive look at the issue. Well, when I was reading Spike in South Asia, I kind of was struck a little bit by the relatively limited discussion on Pakistan, because obviously, at least I would assume that kind of Pakistan was always a major factor on Indian minds when it comes down to cooperating with the US, which was an ally of Pakistan, obviously. So what role do you think Pakistan played into kind of the whole cooperation, intelligence cooperation between New Delhi and Washington and London, for that matter?
So that's another excellent point. And I would completely put my hands up, hold my hands up and say, absolutely, you're absolutely right. And you've hit on a really interesting point there. That Pakistan really is sort of largely absent from the book. And that was a deliberate decision, but obviously it's quite a controversial decision. One of the reasons for that was because quite a lot has been written about Pakistani intelligence and the evolution of Pakistani intelligence. So if you go to most bookshelves or libraries and you've got an intelligence section, you will find books on ISI, particularly inter-services intelligence, and a couple of really good books that are very empirically rich and very well researched for intelligence studies on the ISI have really mapped out their history, really, their institutional history and their international relations, really from 1947 to the present. So I was really aware that there was a big corpus of work on Pakistani intelligence that simply didn't exist for Indian intelligence. So there's a big gap on the Indian side, but Pakistan had been addressed by a number of scholars, both Pakistani scholars, but also by Western scholars as well. So it was like a decision to say, look, a lot of this has already been written about, so I'm not sure I can add anything tremendously new from the Pakistani side, but I can add quite a lot from the Indian side. Then it comes down to publishing, and publishers always want shorter books. No one thanks most authors for writing a longer book, do they? They always want their books to be slightly shorter. Us historians always like a longer book, but the public maybe slightly shorter book. So it's trying to
the opportunity. I'm sorry to interrupt you. Now you have the opportunity to write a book actually focused on Pakistan. So Spike in South Asia focused Pakistan. So
that's absolutely right.
The companion book of the one that you just published.
No, I think you're right. Maybe it's my subliminally, so subconsciously, me trying to create another opportunity to write another book. I think that's probably part of it. I think creating the window to do that. So there is this notion of Pakistan, having a space filled. But interesting as well. That decision not to write so much about Pakistan was also driven by research. So it was an empirical decision to some extent. And that as I was researching the history of India, I was really struck, and I think again you touched on this point superbly. I think by the extent to which certainly the West, so the United States, United Kingdom, for various reasons, compartmentalized its intelligence relationship with South Asia. So it had one intelligence relationship with India, another with Pakistan, and often they didn't interact, or they didn't feed into each other. Well, obviously that's because of the tension, and India goes to war with Pakistan in 1947, in 1965, it goes to war again in 1971, 1999. So there's this constant conflict between the two states. And that complicates not only the diplomatic relationship between the United States, United Kingdom, and India and Pakistan, it also complicates intelligence sharing relationships as well. So both nation states, India and Pakistan, didn't want any of their intelligence to be pooled or shared. And so I think United States and United Kingdom were very conscious of having to keep a wall between the intelligence liaison, support, information sharing between those two nation states. So when I was looking for points for connection, in other words, between what the United States was doing in India and what was doing in Pakistan, it became quite evident quite quickly that they were treated very separately. There was a deliberate decision not to sort of blur the lines between the two. And so often different individuals, really a lot of effort on compartmentalizing the information. And that was driven, I think, by a sort of reality that, Britain and the United States knew that if they didn't do that, then both India and Pakistan would stop working with them in intelligence terms, because the biggest threat to those nation states at various points were the others. So yeah, I think the complication of that relationship made me think that actually there wasn't as interesting a story to tell as I thought there might be. So that sort of pivoted away from Pakistan to some extent. But I do think you're right. I'm writing a book at the moment about the research and analysis wing, or a history of the research and analysis wing. And there will be a lot more about Pakistan in that book, because I think what Pakistan does do is shape the evolution of Indian intelligence in interesting ways. So yeah, there'll be a lot on Kashmir, a lot on the Khalistan movement, a lot of Baluchistan, for example, and how those two intelligence services foment or use intelligence to try and complicate the lives of their adversaries in South Asia.
Yeah, nothing helps you grow so much as a good dushman in many ways.
That's true.
Yeah, it's really amazing how kind of the Americans and the Brits managed to compartmentalize these two relationships. It's kind of a big and probably unspoken success, because obviously that's a very difficult thing to do. Now, one of the really most intriguing part of the book is the discussion of various scandals in the 1960s and 70s. And I mean, to our listeners and watchers, I strongly recommend kind of reading the book just for the scandals. I mean, some of them are really very kind of empirically rich and very interesting. And this includes scandals surrounding a potential American intelligence asset in Indira Gandhi's government in 1971. Some people claim that this is Morarji Desai, who later became prime minister after he turned into a major enemy of her, over time, political enemy, of course. And then there were other cases, for example, of US interference in kind of domestic Indian politics, elections in Kerala, and so on. And of course, there was this kind of story of this nuclear device that was put in the Himalayas, which then was lost, and some people claim that it was kind of poisoning the waters polluting, the waters of Ganges. So there were a lot of kind of major scandals about the US, but there were very few, if any, scandals about the Soviet Union. So why there was this kind of great sensitivity towards spying from the CIA, but so little from the KGB or GRU, which is kind of the military intelligence of the Soviet Union? Was it political? Was it cultural? Why was it? Was it Indira Gandhi? Why were they so focused on the Americans always?
Again, it's a great question. Again, I'm going to give a really complicated answer and say all of those things. I think you'll put your finger on all of those things, really. It's a combination of them. So you're absolutely right. I mean, one of the things that the CIA and also British intelligence get really, really frustrated about in India is the fact that they keep getting public criticism. They keep appearing in newspapers. Politicians keep lambasting, particularly the Central Intelligence Agency, as a sort of lightning rod for everything that's bad in India. And I think they feel that they're getting a really, they're being treated unfairly, because they know, and the Indian state knows, that although the CIA is sort of active in India, although really the peak of CIA activity in India is probably the mid-1960s, and then it tails off quite dramatically in the 1970s. The number of CIA officers operating in India goes down dramatically. They don't conduct as many operations in India as they were in the 1950s and 1960s. So interestingly, at the point in the 50s and 60s where CIA is really active in India internally, funding political parties, also working in collaboration with the Indian Congress Party, as you mentioned, Kerala, to overthrow a democratically elected communist government. So when the CIA is really active, they're not a political issue in India. They don't appear in the Indian press. Indian politicians aren't talking about them. In the 1970s, when the CIA has really wound down its operations in India to a considerable extent, they become a political football in India, and everyone's talking about them, and the Indian politicians are trying to exploit this notion of CIA subversion to Indian democracy, and it becomes a big issue. The CIA get really annoyed by that, and they get annoyed doubly by that, because they know at that point the big intelligence player in India is the GRU and the KGB. So they are much more active in India than the Western intelligence agencies are in the 1970s. And there are lots of reasons for that. India's relationship with the West takes a turn for the worse in 1965 after the India-Pakistan War, and Britain and the United States are seen, rightly or wrongly, to have sided with Pakistan or favoured Pakistan in that conflict. That leads to an Indian pivot strategically to Moscow, and that pivot still exists today in many extents. We're still going through the ramifications of that today with the Rafael deal, for example, and how Moscow's going to react to that, which is quite interesting. So really from 65 onwards, progressively, Moscow becomes the leading military supplier to India. Its economic aid to India grows. It becomes much more important. And off the back of that, the intelligence presence in India from the KGB and the GRU both grow in India exponentially. So the Americans got annoyed saying, look, actually, you're criticizing us, but really look at the Russians. Look what the Russians are doing in India. They're up to much more than we are. And I think that latter criticism is really important. I think it stems from a number of things, really. One is I think there's an ideological affinity with the Soviet Union, particularly that isn't the case with the Americans. So although Gandhi is by no means, I'd emphasize, anti-American, I don't think she is at all. She has really strong connections to America in many senses. She doesn't like many aspects of American foreign policy. She particularly doesn't like Richard Nixon. She looks at the CIA in the 50s and 60s, and people like Alan Dulles openly boasting, yes, we're in the business of regime change. Yes, look what we did in Guatemala, wasn't it amazing? She listens to William Colby in the 1970s saying, yes, we will use the Central Intelligence Agency as a form of covert action to overthrow governments if we think that's in our interest. Very Donald Trump in many senses, in terms of very sort of interventionist and activist foreign policy built on raw American power. So Gandhi's really disturbed by that. And then she looks at the Soviet Union. She's by no means, she understands completely what the Soviet Union is. She doesn't like its social system. She doesn't like its sort of anti-democratic elements, as do many of the Indian population, I think. But what they do sympathise with, the socialist experiment in Russia. They have a lot of respect for the crash program of industrialization in Russia, even though it claims a huge number of victims. We now know the social and human cost of that process of crash industrialization in the 1930s. But from an Indian perspective, it seems, wow, this is a great model for India as a developing nation. Look how quickly the Soviet Union has gone from a peasant economy to a well-respected superpower. Isn't that amazing? So they have that respect there. It's complicated with the United States because of the race question as well. So they look across the United States and the racial tension in the United States in the 50s and 60s and say, how can we support a power that's racist when we are at the forefront of anti-racism globally as part of our decolonization project? So lots of ways in which that relationship is complicated with the United States in ways that it isn't with the Soviet Union, I think. And if you look at public opinion polls in India, interesting, in the 50s and 60s, the Soviet Union usually comes above the United States in terms of public popularity, which is interesting. So there's this sort of almost like societal willingness to give the Soviets the benefit of the doubt in ways that the United States isn't. And that really irritates Washington and London to some extent. So I think there's an ideological and there's a social element to it. I think there's also in Gandhi as well. She's a fantastic political operator, I think, and Srinath, I think, brings that out in his book on Indira Gandhi. She knows there's a political opportunity for her by targeting the Central Intelligence Agency. And I think she assesses that because the CIA has such a sort of malevolent reputation within the global South, quite rightly to some extent, because of its involvement in coups that have removed democratic elected governments, and particularly 1973 with Chile and the removal of Salvador Allende dying, being murdered in the coup in Chile. I think Gandhi looks at that and says, this is an opportunity for me to weaponize the Central Intelligence Agency. So when the Indian economy is tanking, or when things aren't going well, when there's a problem politically or domestically in India, I can externalize that by blaming it on the Central Intelligence Agency. So it becomes a lightning rod for everything that's wrong in India. And because the CIA, because of its reputation, I think globally, that's quite an effective lightning rod. So many Indians believe the fact that the CIA is subverting India. It is bribing Indian political parties and politicians. That he's trying to manipulate the social and political landscape of India. I don't think that's happening at all in the 1970s, or if it is on a very limited scale. But Gandhi's able to sort of project that to a really important facet of what's going on in India. So there's a sort of quite a cold and careful political calculation on how she can use intelligence and Western intelligence as a means of insulating herself from domestic criticism. So yeah, lots going on in terms of informing that sort of process of the Soviets getting quite an easy ride, really, in intelligence terms.
Yeah, I see. Well, thinking about the American kind of involvement in India, we have detected a bit of a paradox there. The more the Americans try to kind of influence, especially in the 1960s, Indian politics, the more they seem to be getting in trouble and creating
Yeah.
a number of difficulties for their diplomatic and political relationship with India. And I think that people like Ambassador Moynihan actually very much detected the same problem. So what was the American misunderstanding of India? Why did they keep on doing this thing regardless of getting kind of poorer and poorer returns? In some ways, they stopped probably in the 1970s, or at least they reduced their
Yep.
exposure in the 1970s. But still, they didn't seem to be giving up on kind of on these activities. So why do you think they proceeded in this way?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting, another really interesting question. And I think the Indian relationship with the United States has always been quite complicated. And I think
Mhm.
during the Cold War period, it got off to a really bad start, where India felt that the Truman administration wasn't really supportive. There were lots of issues around India struggling, for example, with trying to persuade the United States to give it food aid in the
Mhm.
1940s when it was suffering from famine and a bad harvest in India, and Truman being sort of reluctant to do that. Or interestingly, trying to attach political strings to developmental aid. So we mentioned the Soviet Union. One of the good things, or I think effective things that the Soviet Union does to win goodwill in India, both at a political elite level, but also at a popular level, is to offer aid to India with no political strings attached. So yeah, we'll build you a steel mill, but we don't want anything in return. We'll develop this sort of infrastructure system for you, but we don't want anything in return. There is a political price for that, but it's not explicitly set out
Mhm.
by the Soviet government. And so, from an Indian perspective, it can be presented as a goodwill gesture. Whenever the United States tries to do that, with food aid particularly, throughout the 1950s and in the 1960s, it always tries to attach a political string to that. So, yes, we'll give you this aid, but in return, we want you to liberalize your economic system. We want you to try and solve the Kashmir dispute with Pakistan. There always seems to be a sort of a string attached to what the United States is doing during that period. And that really builds Indian resentment, I think, to the United States domestically in India about, well, the Americans, they're always trying to strike this really hard bargain with us. Interesting sort of transactional thing, again, going back to Donald Trump, transactional relationship really that's going on in a way that the Soviet states seem to engage in. So that's
Which got
problematic.
Kashmir and opening India's market, by the way. So
Yeah,
you find strange parallels, I would argue,
yeah, no, it is a strange
and
parallel.
no
And
alignment in some ways too.
yeah, and I think in Cold War terms, ideologically, I think there's also a disconnect because, in the 1950s particularly, we're in the age of Eisenhower and John Foster Dulles, and this Dulles announcing that the immorality of non-alignment, that the Cold War really is almost like a sort of pseudo-religious crusade for Dulles, and there's a good side and a bad side, and you can't, if you're sitting on the fence and equivocating, then you're doing the wrong thing. So quite critical of Nehru's stance on non-alignment, saying, you need to pick a side in this conflict, and obviously you need to pick us because we're democratic, and the Soviet Union's the evil empire, effectively. India's refusal to do that really grates for the United States as well. So you get, and that's the same under the Nixon administration, that they feel like India is sort of equivocating where it should be taking a firm side in the Cold War. So lots of issues around that, I think, which is sort of driving that process. I think as well in the broader context, as we mentioned, really that India is really concerned about how the United States has conducted its foreign policy through the Central Intelligence Agency. So, Eisenhower's first, I guess, been a real proponent of the Central Intelligence Agency, using it as a tool of American foreign policy in Guatemala and Cuba and in Iran and elsewhere. And that's to a certain extent taken by the Kennedy and the Johnson administrations and Nixon. So this sense in which they're building up this antagonism within India, I think is really significant. Really, I think the key thing is, as we sort of touched on, I think Gandhi overplays her hand critically. Her sort of criticism of the Central Intelligence Agency reaches such a fever pitch in the 1970s that it becomes so convenient for her as a political tool to always blame the Central Intelligence Agency, that because she takes it too far, both her domestic critics in India say this is now ridiculous. If there's a cyclone in Orissa, Gandhi's blaming the CIA for it. I mean, it's got so ludicrous proportions, and it sort of loses credibility because she takes it too far. So domestically, it goes from a positive to a negative, I think, by the mid 1970s. But also externally, it becomes real positive because Washington just runs out of patience. So Washington wants India. It's obviously complicated by the Nixon administration's tilt towards Pakistan after 1971. But generally, they want India to be a buffer against communist China. That's been a theme throughout India's post-1947 history, where at some points the United States puts more emphasis on that notion of an Indian buffer, at other points less emphasis on the Indian buffer, depending upon its relationship with China. But generally, that's held true. But the United States, by the mid-1970s, is saying, look, we are fed up with your criticism of the Central Intelligence Agency and your willingness to tolerate Russian intelligence penetration of India. You know the CIA isn't doing anything in India. We've told you they're not doing anything. We've proved it to you, but you're still using it. So it reaches a crisis point where the Ford administration, for example, just cut off economic aid to India. They remove scientific programs, educational cooperation programs. They literally punish India. Through withdrawing American support for a number of sort of programs, developmental programs in India, say, look, you've taken this too far. So it's a real sort of fracture in that relationship, really. So I think, yeah, there's a sort of dialogue of the deaf going on, which is quite interesting, where the United States doesn't really understand India and Indian non-alignment and why it's positioning itself as it does in the Cold War, why it's trying to keep on good terms with both the West and the East, why that makes strategic sense for India in that hedging strategy. And also for the other side, India doesn't really understand the United States. It takes for granted that the United States is always going to support India as a democracy, but US runs out of patience. So I think both of them over time reach a point where their political antennae goes off kilter slightly, and they don't really understand each other at all. So yeah, and I think Moynihan is a good example of that. He sort of throws his hands up in despair, but no matter what he does, this relationship seems to be sort of crashing out of control.
Thank you. Well, my next question is about intelligence successes, because obviously, about every intelligence service is constantly counted and blamed for its failures, and this, of course, includes Indian intelligence.
Yeah.
So, what are the greatest, in very brief, what are the greatest successes of Indian intelligence, of RAW and Intelligence Bureau before it?
Yeah, it's a great point, and you made me feel a bit guilty because I teach intelligence failures. So I think we need to make sure we balance that with intelligence successes. You're absolutely right. Intelligence successes either often go under the radar because they're underreported, because these don't get the same publicity really. But India has a really strong record of actually intelligence success. So to counterbalance maybe 1962 and 1965. There's a really good example, I think, interesting, in 1955, where Oren Cow, who's an intelligence bureau officer at that point, but goes on to be the first head of the Research Analysis Bureau in September 1968, and is a real sort of is on very good terms with the Gandhi family. So Indira Gandhi makes him head of research analysis in September 1968. Cow pioneers intelligence diplomacy, which I think is quite interesting. So you may remember there's a Kashmir Princess incident in 1955 where at the Bandung conference, Chavan Wai is going to the Bandung conference. He's due to fly from Hong Kong. He changes planes at the last minute, and the plane he's supposed to be on is sabotaged by a bomb planted by what we believe to be a Chinese nationalist. And the plane basically explodes and goes down off the coast of Indonesia. That puts India in a really tricky position because that plane is an Air India plane. So India is directly involved in potentially an assassination attempt on the Chinese Prime Minister. And Cow is tasked by Nehru with basically liaising with British colonial authorities because the plane's taken up from Hong Kong. So the British have equity in this. China, because China has equity in it, because they tried to assassinate the Chinese delegation to Bandung. And so Cow shuttles backwards and forwards between London, between Washington, between Beijing, and between Hong Kong, and does an amazing job as an intelligence officer at defusing what could be a real international crisis. I mean, potentially that has real serious ramifications for the United States relationship with China, China's relationship with Hong Kong. But Cow does a really excellent job at winning the trust of Chinese officials, Hong Kong officials, British colonial officials, and dampening that down. So interesting, like Bill Burns and stuff's done quite a lot of intelligence diplomacy. John Radcliffe slightly less, but it's sort of a proto example of how intelligence diplomacy can be really effective, using a back channel to diffuse diplomatic and political tensions at a time of crisis. And that's a really good example, I think, of India pioneering that sort of thing, which is interesting. I think other examples are in colonial context. So India helps form the Ghana's first intelligence service, the Foreign Research Bureau. Foreign Service Research Bureau, in the late 1950s, early 1960s. And again, that's part of a colonial project. So Nehru is approached by Kwame Nkrumah, who's the Prime Minister of Ghana, when Ghana becomes independent in 1957. And Nehru says, look, we need an intelligence service. We need, you guys have been through a similar thing where you become independent, you've got no really functioning intelligence service. How do you form one? The KGB have offered to form an intelligence service for us. The British have offered to form an intelligence service for us. The CIA have offered to form an intelligence service for us. But obviously, we don't really want that because they're going to control our intelligence service, or at least have influence over it. could you, as an independent fellow nation state in the global south, could you help us form an intelligence service, which means we're not under that sort of level of direct control by the East or the West? India says, yep, absolutely. And he sends 2 IB intelligence officers out to Ghana, and they basically India helps to construct Ghana's first intelligence service. So it's a really South-South cooperation, example of South-South cooperation in intelligence terms, which I think is a tremendous success for India. I think the other one is Bangladesh in 1971, where the research analysis wing has only just been formed in September 1968. But it conducts an incredible intelligence operation in 1971 using training paramilitary forces inside East Pakistan, which goes on to be Bangladesh, conducts a proper sophisticated propaganda operation against the Pakistani state for the liberation of Bangladesh and Bangladeshi independence, persuades Bengali figures in Bangladesh to defect and to come to India and criticize Pakistan. So it's a really sort of sophisticated paramilitary psychological warfare operation that's conducted by Indian intelligence, and I think is quite materially influential in the success of Bangladesh becoming a nation state in 1971. I'm going to give you a couple of others very quickly. The one in 1974, which is a counterintelligence success, which I think is interesting because we tend to focus on intelligence rather than counterintelligence. So India exploding its first PNA, a peaceful nuclear explosion in 1974, Smiling Buddha. The extent to which India is able to do that without being detected by the Central Intelligence Agency is really a tribute to the counterintelligence success of research and analysis wing in keeping that operation secret. So RAW has control of that operation and its security, and it does a fantastic job of camouflaging the preparations for that test to the extent that the CIA aren't able to tip off the American president that this test is going to take place. And it's a real scandal in the CIA that they can't do that. So a real counterintelligence success, I think, for India then. Yeah, and the last one I think, which is much more controversial, maybe we can think of, is Sikkim. So Sikkim is that sort of northern state in the Himalayas, and in 1975 it's incorporated into the Indian Union after a sort of popular uprising against the monarchy in Sikkim. And that uprising is really, we now know, fomented by the research analysis wing. They pay for protests. They conduct a propaganda campaign against the monarchy. They try to manipulate a referendum, which turns out to be, I think, 97.5% in favour of removing the monarchy. I'm always suspicious of referendums when they get into the high 90%. So strikes me as obviously subject to manipulation. So yeah, I guess in some senses it's anti-democratic. In other senses, it's a really successful intelligence operation in sort of forwarding India's international security interests by incorporating the state of Sikkim. So yeah, there's a long track record of quite impressive success in Indian intelligence, I think.
Well, because we're starting a little bit to be pressured by time, let me
Sure.
fast forward, and I think I have 2 more remaining questions.
Okay.
So one question is about writing such a book. Obviously, writing on intelligence history is a very complex thing, which relies on access to archives, declassification schedules, willingness to declassify, and so on. So how did you, what obstacles did you encounter in researching and writing this book, and how did you overcome them?
Yeah, it's always a bit scary writing an intelligence book because you're never quite sure if you're going to be able to accumulate enough materials to construct a narrative that holds together, really. And I think because of that, inevitably, intelligence books tend to be a little bit episodic because you'll get a period of time or a particular incident where you're able to find and accumulate lots of materials. And you want to continue that narrative on with the same sort of level of strength and empiricism. But it becomes more difficult because sources become more fractured. There's less on it, particularly when it's a controversial issue. And it is, I guess, akin to like constructing a jigsaw. I always equate it's like intelligence analysis, really. Every intelligence analyst wants to have all the pieces of a jigsaw, but often they only have a fraction of those pieces and they have to construct a picture out of it. And writing an intelligence book is not dissimilar to that, I think, in that we always want to have all the pieces of the jigsaw. But we often don't have them. So it's trying to be creative and innovative and filling in the gaps that we don't have with other means, really. I was, however, really surprised at the amount of archival material that is available on Indian intelligence. Partly that's by mining American archives and British archives, which are much more accessible. And I guess American archives are the gold standard of intelligence historians, really, in terms of the CIA and other intelligence agencies, for various reasons, like coming up the Church Committee, and have made a lot more publicly available information on intelligence practice, particularly by the CIA. And that gives you, although one step removed, a real window into other intelligence services, particularly in the global south. And even, for example, the John F. Kennedy assassination records, which have been recently released, are a treasure trove of information on Indian intelligence, bizarrely. If you look into those records, there's lots of CIA reporting about what Indian intelligence was doing, liaison relationships with Indian intelligence, even Indian intelligence operations conducted inside the United States. So fascinating sort of perspective on, just need to be a bit creative in where you look for intelligence, really. And even in Indian archives, although the research and analysis wing has not formally released a single one of its records. So quite difficult to get access on. What you do find is if you look in Indian archives, in Treasury files or Home Ministry files, you will often find information on raw or even whole raw files that have been sent to that ministry, and that ministry hasn't then weeded them or removed them from their files. So it's also accidentally coming across intelligence information. That's amazing. So you find a file that's, that shouldn't be in the archive, but is. That's an incredible find. It does make it actually quite complicated and time consuming and fragmented, though, because you can't go to a file series and think, well, I know the intelligence files are going to be here. It's very much sort of hoping to find something and often not finding it, but occasionally finding it. So yeah, piecing together a jigsaw is the way I would approach it. And I guess one of the ways of connecting that is oral history. So thinking about how oral history, although it has its drawbacks and we have to be really careful with the way we use it, it can provide really interesting insights into plugging gaps that archives just present to us, really. So yeah, I found oral history really useful as well. So yeah, mixed method approach, really, and then trying to spend as much time combing through dusty archives as you possibly can. And I think the other thing is focusing on private papers. So state archives tend to be much more efficient at removing intelligence files from public access. Where if you go into university libraries or private institutions and you find the private papers of intelligence officials, they tend to be on the whole much richer and much more informative than state papers would be.
Yeah, and one day one can imagine that one can find kind of Russian or Pakistani or Eastern European kind of materials on this subject, because I'm pretty sure that there is a lot of stuff there, but regrettably it hasn't come in the English speaking mainstream, and it will be very, very interesting because probably they had their own version of many of the very same events and kind of interesting insights. So let me move to my last question. Initially I was thinking of asking you a so what question, but I'm sure you get this very often, and by the way you address it in your final chapter with a quotation from Ian Fleming. So actually, I'm going to ask you about the legacy of this intelligence cooperation between Britain, the US, and India. If you can kind of name three major legacies, and you can think, for example, of strengths and weaknesses that it endowed to RAW. So what would be the three greatest legacies of this cooperation for the history of Indian intelligence or even Indian foreign policy? Why not?
So yeah, another great question. So I'm going to give three. One's going to be, I think, negative. One will be more positive, and one I'm not sure about. So it'd be interesting to get your perspective on this, Ivan, because I think yeah, good balance. But I think the third one, I'm gonna defer to you because you know much more about this than I do. I'm much more of an expert in this subject. So the first one, the negative one, is I think intelligence, particularly Western intelligence intervention in India, fueled a conspiratorial national culture in politics. So I think Indira Gandhi was slightly responsible for this, but I think also the West has to take some responsibility because of its use of covert action across the global South. So we mentioned Iran, Guatemala, Congo, Chile, those sort of examples. That use of covert action and that acknowledgement that the United States was going to try and subvert the political systems of other nation states, I think fueled this sense of conspiratorialism in India and conspiracism. And so even today, whenever the Central Intelligence Agency is mentioned in India, even though Indian relations to the United States, although they've experienced a bump in the road recently, have tended to be much better over the last 25 years or so, the CIA is still regarded as this sort of anti-democratic malefactor, evil force of the Indian society that Indians can't trust and is trying to overthrow the government. So this notion of conspiracism, I think, is really rooted in intelligence practice in the Cold War. I think it has longer roots as well, so it has some sort of colonial roots, but I think it was amplified and extended and weaponized within Cold War India. And that legacy still carries on to today. I think it's a really unhealthy legacy in any political system when it's sort of there's a strong strand of conspiracism running through it. It's sort of it makes people cynical about politics. It's sort of that it colours to some extent their international relations as well as a nation state. So I think that's a really negative consequence of it. A more positive consequence, I think, is the enduring legacy of intelligence liaison. One of the things I was really struck by when I was researching the book was the extent to which intelligence is almost like a golden thread running through India's relationship with Britain and the United States particularly. So
The
even
golden
at
road, so
points,
to speak.
yeah, the golden road, like William Dalrymple's golden ray. So we'll say the golden thread.
Yeah.
So there is this intelligence golden thread where even at points like I'll give you an example in 1971 where Richard Nixon tilts decisively to Pakistan when Bangladesh is going through its sort of independence process and there's a war between India and Pakistan over Bangladesh's independence. Even at that point when Nixon tilts towards Pakistan and every public statement made by the Nixon administration is attacking India, relationships are poisonous and toxic between New Delhi and Washington, really at a low ebb. Within the records, the research analysis wing is still talking to the CIA, still keeping that channel open, still trying to cooperate, still sort of exchanging information. It's remarkable that intelligence sort of is robust enough, those intelligence channels, to weather the nadir really of politics and diplomacy between these two countries. And I think that's been a common factor that the importance of intelligence and what it can bring for national security and just generally in politics in those two countries has meant that it's really much more robust than I thought it would be. Even at points of sort of existential crisis, it's remained open. So I think that's very positive. And we've experienced that, as we said recently, with people like Bill Burns, using his position to reach out and try and broker a peace settlement in Ukraine and all those sort of things. Intelligence can be really important as part of that process, I think. So that was a really positive legacy. The one I'm uncertain about, and again, I'm going to defer to you, Ivan, on this because I think you know more about than I do, is China. So I'm going to say China and sort of the Cold War focus that was placed on China and India's place in the Western imagination in acting as a buffer to China, a means of controlling China or limiting China's power, both regionally and globally. I think it's interesting. I think that's waxed and waned, as I said, in terms of America's the extent to which America believes India has utility in acting as a sort of counterpoint to China. I think that's ebbed and flowed over time. But I think that is a really strong strand that comes through in the book, in that China is a really important factor in how America manages its relationship with India, both in intelligence terms, but also in wider political terms as well. And we mentioned like divorcing India and Pakistan, which I think, I think I could have done a better job at linking those two together in the book, certainly. But I think China is absolutely crucial. You cannot understand America's relationship with India in intelligence terms or any terms without thinking about China.
Yes, I very much agree, and I think this is very kind of a shrewd observation because even some of the specific issues between India and China, such as the Tibet issue, are very much the product of this cooperation, and the Dalai Lama is still in Dharamsala at the end of the day. So this is very much part of this whole China legacy that you talk about. Well, Dr. McGarr, thank you so much for a very fascinating interview. Congratulations once again on publishing Spying in South Asia. It was a real pleasure having you. And, well, wish you a very successful remainder of the semester. Actually, you're at the beginning of the semester now, aren't you? Or
yeah, we're about halfway through, I think. Ivan.
Okay,
so yeah, we're
through.
sort of
yes, it's halfway
we can
through.
see light at the end of the tunnel.
Yes. So there is light at the end of the tunnel. Thank you so much, and hope to stay in touch.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for the interview. I've greatly enjoyed it. It's really kind of you to invite me onto the program. So thank you so much.
It was a pleasure. Looking forward to your next book. Take care.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thanks very much.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.